Hello everyone, Dr. Yang here for part one of our last set of videos. So we are going to be talking about research ethics, which may not sound super exciting, but I promise there's more to it than you realize. So let's go ahead and dive in. So first things first, I want to remind you all that you have a literature review that is due. This is due by the 5th at 11:59 p.m. This is a firm deadline. Because I need to make sure that I have time to grade all of your stuff before final grades are due. So you all turned in your drafts and got feedback from me on those. So again, most of you got feedback that was like, this is still too much like an annotated bibliography. Work on integration and work on flow and organization. So keep working on that. If you have questions, let me know. I know there's a couple of you who have some one-on-ones scheduled with me. But I do apologize, kind of that last week before break, there was a lot of emails that were flurrying and I might have missed an email from somebody. So if you need to schedule a time to meet with me and you have not been able to do so, please send me another message. I promise I will not be mad and we will get it scheduled so that you can ask questions and get whatever support you need to be successful on this assignment. Now here's what I want you to know. We call this social work practice, right? We don't call it social work perfect. Even people like me, whose whole job is to do research and write manuscripts, get tons of feedback on documents before we submit them for the final time. I have an article right now that's been under review for a year where we have gone back and forth giving feedback and making changes. So I don't want you to be perfect here, okay? I just want you to do your best. So here's how I'm gonna grade it. I'm just gonna tell you, and I'm gonna be very straightforward. I'm going to pull up your rough draft and I'm going to look at what comments I gave you. And I'm going to pull up your final draft and I'm going to see how well you integrated the comments from the midterm into the final to see your growth. I am looking for growth, I am looking for effort, and I am looking for hard work. I am not looking for perfect, okay? So do your best, try really hard, but if you have any questions, let me know. Sound good? Okay, now let's talk about ethics. So I want you to just sort of pause for a moment and reflect on, why do you think ethics are so important? And what kind of things do you think can happen if we don't engage in ethical practice? So just pause the video here, reflect on this. Okay, so I'm going to tell you some of the things that happen. Perhaps most famously, is that the Nazi Party is quite famous for the experiments that they committed on Jewish folk, on mentally challenged folk, and on gay and lesbian folk throughout World War II. Unfortunately, there are a lot of medicines, there are a lot of practices that we use even today because of those experiments, but we don't want to make that standard practice. We don't ever want to sort of have live guinea pigs where we are treating humans or even making them sick so that we can treat them without their consent. There's also the famous Tuskegee syphilis study, which is discussed on page 36 in your book. But the long story short is that almost 400 Black folks with syphilis purposefully were not treated, even though treatment was available, just so that they could study the long-term effects of syphilis. Now, we did learn some important things about the long-term effects of syphilis, including the damage that it can cause to the brain. But these results were not ethically obtained, and there really is no reason for us to keep these results because people weren't able to consent, they didn't understand, and there was no discussion of like, hey, we're not treating you for this disease even though there's a treatment. Is that cool? Like, we just didn't do that. So that's a problem. There's also the Willowbrook school incident, which is where almost 700 children who were developmentally delayed were intentionally infected with hepatitis just so we could understand the impacts of the disease and how to possibly treat it. Okay, so here we see lots of vulnerable people, right? Jewish folk, gay and lesbian folk, Black folk in the South, and developmentally delayed children were all taken advantage of for the purpose of experimentation. That's a problem, right? So thankfully, some steps have been taken, but sadly, this was not until 1974, after the conclusion of the Tuskegee research trial, Congress passed the National Research Act in 1974, which really laid the groundwork for us on ethical protections for human subjects. So the enactment of this law eventually led to the creation of the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects. And this is a body of folk whose entire purpose is to make sure that when research is conducted, it is done ethically and that human subjects are treated fairly, justly, and safely. Lastly, we have the Belmont Report, and this report is one that if you've ever had to take city training or that IRB training, you've had the privilege of reading this report. This goes through all of the ethical principles that should underlie any research that involves human subjects. So this talks about many of the principles that we're going to cover here in a minute. But really, these three things helped us to help to guide us as researchers in taking steps to protect human subjects from unethical practices. So I want to dive just a little bit more deeply into the Belmont Report because there's three main ideas that are central to this report. Okay, and the first is respect for all persons. So we need to make sure that people who are participating are able to participate in research. They're able to make informed decisions. They understand what you are asking them to consent to. You're not trying to dupe people. So thinking back to those developmentally delayed children and other folks who might be compromised, we're not trying to trick them into participating in our research. And that's really important. But the other principles are beneficence, which means we aim first to do no harm. We're not going to intentionally torture people just for the sake of research. We have a purpose, and that we are doing everything we can to maximize benefits of knowledge while minimizing the risks to our human participants. Lastly, justice. We can't necessarily target folks to take on all of the risk when other people benefit. So this might include prisoners, children, or folks who are disabled or otherwise compromised or marginalized. It's not fair to make Black people, to make gay people, to make children, to make prisoners be subject to our experiments just so that we can learn what happens. That's not just. That's not fair. We can't do that. So when we talk about doing no harm, there are many protections that are in place to prevent harm or abuse and protect vulnerable groups. Some of this includes, we can't experiment on prisoners unless it is very clearly applicable to them and we have their consent. It is not almost impossible. It is very difficult to do research on children or women who are pregnant or any other marginalized group without very clearly explaining to your IRB, which we're going to talk about in part 2, how you have put protections in place for those people. Now, in addition to the guidelines outlined by the Belmont Report and enforced by institutional review boards, the NASW also has their own set of ethical guidelines which fall under those 6 values and principles that shape our profession. So you can reference those on page 37 and 38 in your text. But those are things that are going to be familiar to you. Informed consent, competence of workers, social justice, relationships, those kinds of things. So anytime we talk about research, there's a tension, right? There's a tension between finding the truth, getting our answer, getting to the bottom of whatever issue it is that we are trying to understand, but also the fact that we must do no harm, right? So back to the Tuskegee trial. We learned a lot about syphilis and its effect on a human in the life course, and the horrible things that syphilis can do to the human brain if left untreated. There's even types of psychosis that can be caused by syphilis if left untreated. That knowledge was very important, but how we gained that was entirely unethical. And so we have to balance this, right? We can't subject people to inhumane experiments just because we're curious or because we have a question. That's not cool. We can't do that. So we always have to wrangle with this tension. So really, as we are moving forward, I just want you all to think about how can we take steps to ensure that our participants are treated ethically and they're treated fairly. Thankfully, our institutions and our profession have some guidelines that we're going to talk about here in part 2. But really, it all comes back to this balance. We have to find the truth, but we also have to make sure that we do no harm. So thanks for listening. Head on over and check out part 2. Bye, everybody.